Sector 9's artificial rain came down in mean little threads, the kind that never quite warmed a body yet slicked every surface until it reflected neon like a fever dream. Under the fractured arc of a maintenance dome, an alien woman sheltered two small girls with the stubborn geometry of her own body, turning her cloak into a roof and her ribs into a wall. She had a warrior's posture despite the years stamped into her spine, eyes the clear gold of old coin, and a voice that had been trained for command before life reassigned it to apologies. The district knew her as the silent mother in Bay Alley, but once her name had been Ashera of the House of Dawn. Her daughters, Malin with the careful hands, Syria with the humming mouth, were all sharp angles and oversized pupils, gray-skinned like fog, silver-eyed like ice thawing too slowly. They smelled faintly of copper and wet canvas, the perfume of children raised under leaky roofs. People learned to avoid them with an efficiency born of practice. Merchants moved their displays by a meter and pretended it was for foot traffic. Patrol drones edged their flight paths wider by a degree. Pedestrians developed the ancient skill of seeing through anyone who costs them nothing but conscience. Hunger sat in that alley like a third child, obedient, patient, waiting for permission to speak. When the wind shifted, it brought the market's arguments to their corner. The clang of pan lids, the haggling of buyers who never loved anything enough to pay fairly, the sweet lie of caramelizing fruit from a cart that had never once given away a bruised pear. Ashera counted time by sounds instead of clocks. The hiss of a kettle 3 doors down meant morning, the hiss of a bad-tempered pipe at the corner meant night, and shaped the hours as best she could around the girls' small needs. She gave them the stories she had left, edited for gentleness, changing endings that had once been full of strategy into endings that were full of soup. When Malin asked about beds, Ashera described mattresses that sighed when you lay down. When Syria asked what a door was for, she said, to keep out rain, to invite in friends, and to teach the wind manners. She wanted to believe herself and could not quite. The wind kept misbehaving. It was late, and the drizzle had downgraded to a pettiness that felt personal. When a man came down the alley with the walk of someone who knows how to keep his balance on a moving deck. He wore a Terran field coat with the medical caduceus stitched at the shoulder where medals go when you run out of chest, and he carried a satchel that clinked faintly with the soft bell of instruments that fix rather than punish. He saw the configuration: mother as rampart, children as cargo, alley as court, and stopped as if the scene had thrown a line around his ribs. There was nothing heroic in the way he crouched. It was the ordinary economy of a man who has knelt beside too many kinds of suffering to make a spectacle of the next one. The coat's hood slid back, revealing a face weathered more by decisions than by years, and the artificial rain webbed itself between his lashes without making him blink. He said, "Evening," as if greeting neighbors at a fence. Ashera's chin lifted 2 degrees, enough to show dignity, without offering challenge. The girls tightened their grip on her cloak, and the cloak tightened its grip on the girls. The man introduced himself without rank. Dalen Vance, medic, as if the job description could fit inside a name and behave. He set his satchel on the ground with a care that made the concrete seem worthy of respect, then unfastened the flap and took out heat the way magicians take out doves. First, a foil pouch that he tucked under the cloak so it could warm small bellies without asking permission, then a thermal blanket he didn't unfold until the girls had watched him long enough to decide curiosity outweighed fear. He offered the edge to Ashera, not the whole thing, as if handing over a decision rather than a donation. When she took it and draped it around all 3 of them with the efficiency of someone who has done more with less, the alley learned a new shape. The rain found a new rhythm on the blanket and the satchel. Dalen opened a ration pack, split a protein bar with the precise imprecision of a soldier who knows small pieces swallow easier, and placed 1/2 near Malin's knee and 1 near Syria's rather than into their hands. "There," he said, as if pointing out stars. Ashera watched him watching them and waited to be disgusted by pity. The disgust did not arrive. She tasted one of the reheated lumps herself first, an old officer's trick that teaches subordinates and children the absence of poison, and only then nodded at the girls. Malin ate like a clerk recording transactions. small, careful bites, eyes on the man's hands in case they tried to change the terms. Syria ate like a song she half remembered, quick, then slower, then with a sigh that sounded like a key finding a lock. The alley had rules. Dalen broke none of them. He kept his voice low enough that shame could not hear, and his gaze steady enough that fear could rest. He did not ask questions that make people bleed just to prove they can. When he unfolded a dry cloth and, without touching skin, set it near Ashura's cheek, she stared at it for a long second as if calculating tax, then took it and pressed it to her face with a gratitude that refused to act like an invoice. The cloth came away gray-brown and irrelevantly heroic. "No one should be cold like this," Dalen said, not righteous, not rhetorical, only tired of seeing the same mistake in different uniforms. Somewhere overhead, a service drone reconsidered its flight plan and swung wide, but the alley's newest geometry, medic kneeling, mother braced, girls eating, stayed exactly where it was. The girls had eaten enough to exchange panic for curiosity, which is the currency of children not yet allowed to be children. Silver eyes, so large they carried their own gravity, tracked Dalen's hands as he worked. The way his thumbs found the tabs on the blanket without snapping them. The way he counted to 6 under his breath when the heat pack hissed a little steam. The way he kept the satchel between himself and the world, rather than between himself and them. His movements announced a language they hadn't heard since eviction. "I will explain what I am doing. I will not move faster than your understanding. I will stop when you say stop." Dalen unhooked a portable scanner, the little wand dropping a soft cone of milk-colored light, and asked in a voice that had been trained by tense and triage, "May I check for fever?" He waited long enough for silence to offer an opinion. Ashera gave a bare nod that translated from old court to present alley as consent, and he began with the back of his hand to the girls' foreheads. Human ritual that says machines don't get all the authority. The younger one, Syria, he would learn, leaned into the touch as if testing whether bone remembers comfort. The older, Maylun, stood her ground in a way that told him she'd been standing her ground longer than she'd been alive. Dalen smiled them both without condescension and logged the numbers on a slate with big block letters, like a teacher, making sure the back row can see. "No fever," he said, and because truth earns more truth, Maylin tried a sentence. "Are you going to hurt our mom too?" It was not a challenge so much as an audit conducted by a soul that had learned accounts do not balance in the end. The words landed with the precise weight of a hammer on glass. Dalen had been asked for morphine by men missing half their names, and for last letters home by women who did not romanticize bravery. But he had not been asked that. The alley shrank until it was only that question, and then it expanded until it was the whole planet. He could have said no in a dozen ways, protocols, pledges, jokes, but all of them sounded like receipts, and he was tired of issuing paperwork to a universe that preferred fines. He put the scanner down so his hands were empty, peeled off his gloves so his fingers had nothing to hide behind, and answered in the grammar he trusted when nothing else would hold. "No," he said, and the vowel shook once. "I am here to keep harm away, starting with me." He let the sentence sit where it fell until it stopped trembling. Syria's chin lifted by a courageous millimeter. Malin's mouth gave up its sternness and trembled toward something like relief that didn't dare call itself by name. Ashera, who had been taking inventory of exits since the first sound of approaching boots, let her shoulders descend the height of a breath. Dalen exhaled as if he had been holding that air since the war, then returned to the work that keeps promises honest. He examined Ashera's ribs through the torn fabric with the flat fingertips that look for crepitus, and find instead the history of rooms too cold to forgive. He slid the scanner along her side and frowned at the penalty the past had applied to her right lung. "We need warmth, food with ambition, time," he said, narrating not to impress but to reassure. "We need a place where nothing expects you to apologize for breathing." He opened the satchel again and produced the twin saints of survival, a thermal blanket that remembered how to be a hug and a field tent mean enough to keep a promise. The blanket he draped with theatrical care, as if crowning, not covering, The tent he assembled in a choreography that turned institutional green into sanctuary in 10 practiced moves. He did not try to move them until the shelter existed. Then he turned and offered his forearms, not his hands. Wrists up, so Ashera could see there were no surprises hiding in the grip. She hesitated, looked down at the girls as if to borrow their courage, then slid her palms onto his sleeves and let him help her rise in inches. Malin and Syria climbed into the low tent first, rolling like kittens into the pooled heat, their heads popping out of the flap to watch the rest of the miracle assemble. Inside the tent, the world changed its job. Sound softened, rain became a polite tap instead of an interrogation, and the air had the nerve to be warm. Dalen strung a small lantern that tinted everything with a little gold. Ashera's eyes answered the color as if greeting a cousin, and set water to boil on a compact heater that smelled faintly of optimism packaged by an engineer. He broke open a pouch of stew and talked while it warmed. Nothing grand, just the inventory of safe nouns that build a room. Spoon, cup, blanket, pillow, sleep. Syria scooted sideways until her shoulder found his knee. Malin, who kept itemizing his movements like a responsible clerk, finally underlined her checklist with a yawn. Ashera watched them both and then looked at Dalen as if the universe had dared to do arithmetic correctly for once. When the food was gone and the girl's hands had learned the shape of full for the first time, Dalen made himself a backrest against the tent wall and invited gravity to be useful. He pulled his coat into his lap and gestured without insistence. Malun, after performing an inspection with a frown that would make auditors applaud, curled into the offered space with the suspicion of a small animal trained to distrust kindness and the relief of a child who would like not to for a while. Syria followed with less ceremony and more humming, her song stumbling into a lullaby that no translator would bother to catalog and no scholar could improve. Ashera lay down last, not because she didn't trust the bed, but because she refused to sleep before the sentries were posting. When she did, it was with the careful abandon of a soldier finally relieved. Outside, the alley resumed its business of practicing indifference. Inside, the tent learned a new definition of quiet. Dalen watched the lantern dim to its lowest setting and let his breath find a rhythm that would not jostle the heads on his chest. He thought of every time he had arrived at a crisis late and of the one time he had arrived exactly when someone needed a hand that did not ask for proof. No, he repeated under his breath, not to contradict anything, but to extend the promise across the dark. The words settled into the fabric and the faces against him like a seal pressed into warm wax. Rain adjusted itself to a kinder tempo, and the district, which had survived on rules that punished softness, failed for once to interfere. Dawn came late to Sector 9, arriving as a gray opinion rather than a color. And Dalen used the hour before it to turn the tent into a clinic that could pass for a promise. He warmed water until steam stitched the air, laid out gauze and sealant like chess pieces, and asked permission for every touch, as if consent itself were an anesthetic. Ashera's right lung whispered the way damaged bellows do. The scanner mapped an old contusion starved of care, 3 ribs that had knitted wrong out of stubbornness, and a lattice of scar along the flank where a blade had been persuaded to change its mind mid-thrust. He set a gentle brace, taped with the neat ruthlessness field medicine teaches, and showed her how breath could be coaxed back into larger spaces without tearing the fragile work of sleep. Malin counted along with him in 4s and 6s until breathing sounded like cooperation. Syria hummed a melody that matched the cadence and pretended it was for the kettle, not their mother. When the antiseptic stung, Ashera did not flinch for herself, but for the girls, eyes darting to measure whether pain would make him impatient. It didn't, and the tent learned to believe that. He cleaned the small, treacherous wounds poverty specializes in, pressure sores that kept trying to be permanent, a split knuckle that told the story of a wall that had refused to move, a row of abrasions that looked like the handwriting of concrete. He trimmed 2 jagged nails with surgeon's respect, explained why hunger makes the body steal from bone, and handed Ashera a swallow of broth between steps, so the lesson never sounded like judgment. "You don't owe me endurance," he said when she grit her teeth out of habit, and the sentence startled her more than the antiseptic ever had. A neighbor drifted close with a loaf that wanted to be eaten before it got stale, and a child from the next bay delivered a chipped cup that, by coincidence, already knew how to be a favorite. Generosity, having failed to find a permit, snuck in anyway. Dalen wrote their names on a sheet he thumbtacked to the tent pole. Ashera, Mylan, Syria, because rooms behave better when they know who they're protecting, and underlined Ashera's twice in a hand that turned ink into oath. When he finally leaned back, shoulders complaining in the dialect of old campaigns, he found the girls staring with the solemnity reserved for miracles that remember to bring instructions. They practiced ordinary until it felt like an achievement. Malin learned how to fold gauze into precise squares that told wounds to mind their manners. Syria learned where their thermal pack should sit so warmth improved breath rather than stealing it. Ashera learned, against the muscle memory of 100 doorways, that asking for water did not incur a fee. "If your pain changes color, you tell me," Dalen said during the last dressing, and the phrasing made her laugh once, short and confused, as if a joke had wandered into the tent without washing its hands. The laugh loosened something that had been clenched so long it had forgotten its original purpose. "Vance," she said, testing his name like a bridge plank, "we cannot pay." He wiped his fingers on a cloth already proud of its stains, and answered the way a field medic answers when everyone in the room has bled enough. "Then we will owe each other the things money never learned to carry." By midday, a message arrived wrapped in officious italics. "Report to the Sector 9 Relief Council for clarification of aid boundaries." Dalen read it once, then twice, and recognized the cadence of men who mistake paperwork for mercy. He zipped the tent, slung his satchel, and walked Ashera and the girls toward the administrative corridor with the unhurried stride of someone who refuses to let urgency do his thinking. The corridor echoed with the kind of clean that smells like disapproval. Walls hung with posters reminding citizens that safety is a shared performance. A clerk with a practiced frown waved them through, already composing the anecdote she would tell later about the medic who brought weather into the building. 3 counselors sat beneath a light that made everyone look guilty. Their robes had more creases than their questions. "You've established an unsanctioned treatment site," one began, fingers tented like a precaution. "There are protocols for integrating unstable alien elements." Ashera went still at the phrase, not with fear, but with the discipline of a soldier choosing which hill to take. The girls tucked tighter to her sides and watched Dalen as if he were a verdict they intended to memorize. He set the slate on the table, opened scans and vitals, and the quiet arithmetic of survival, and spoke with the exact courtesy that makes arrogance sound clumsy. "She is not an element. She is a patient, a parent, and a citizen under your own charter's promise of relief. The instability here is hunger." The nearest counselor cleared his throat with bureaucratic gravitas, the sound of furniture believing itself to be law. "We can offer relocation to a holding dormitory pending species clearance," he said, which everyone in the room knew meant a warehouse with beds jealous of warmth and rules allergic to children. Malin's voice arrived before Dalen's could. "Are you going to hurt our mom too?" she asked, repeating the question that had already changed one alley and now asked for a corridor. Silence performed its tricks, first the offended kind, then the thinking kind, then the kind that realizes it has an audience. Syria, hand flat against Ashera's ribs like a medic's apprentice, added a phrase in her mother's older tongue that the translator took a respectful moment to render. "We came for permission to be safe." Dalen let the lines land, then pushed the slate toward the counselors until numbers began to work on them like tied on pylons. "She has a partial lung collapse that will resolve with rest and heat," he said. "2 healing ribs, and dependent minors whose prognosis improves by an obscene percentage if we keep them together with someone who knows their names. You can sign a waiver for the tent and assign a sanitation crew to feel useful, or you can drag 3 people through an intake machine that eats futures." The senior counselor, older by a decade and a handful of regrets, looked at the girls, at the neat tape along Ashera's side, at Dalen's hands still stained with the day's work, and remembered perhaps a winter in which he had not yet learned how to make compassion wait for forms. "Authorize the waiver?" he said, and the clerk's pen, long deprived of decent surprises, raced to keep up. The youngest counselor attempted a face-saving harumph and tripped over his own throat. The middle one scribbled notes that would later be misfiled under precedent. Dalen didn't bow. He collected the stamped clearance, folded it once, and gave it to Mylin, who slid it into the pocket of her too-big coat with the ceremony of a coronation. Ashera exhaled a fraction deeper, the brace along her ribs translating relief into permissible motion, and Syria leaned into Dalen's leg as if gravity had decided to be specific. On the way back, the district felt different by small, provable degrees. A sanitation drone paused at the tent flap and, finding the waiver, whistled a little tune it had learned from traffic lights. The noodle vendor left a bowl on the crate with a note that pretended to be a receipt. A patrolman stopped just long enough to ask whether the brace should be adjusted when the weather turned mean. Dalen opened the tent and the warm air met them with the uncomplicated loyalty of a dog that has decided whom it belongs to. He set the kettle. Ashera settled with the care of someone who has learned not to apologize for sitting, and the girls arranged the cups like diplomats setting a table for treaty. "We are allowed," Malin said, not as a question but as an inventory item finally listed correctly. Dalen raised his mug as if this were a thing civilized planets do every afternoon. "We are allowed," he agreed, and the steam that rose from the tin rim smelled for the first time in Sector 9's memory like a rule worth keeping. Sector 9's evening settled in with its usual performative indifference. Neon doing its best moon impression, rain downgraded to a mist that practiced disappointment, when the sirens learned a new vowel. It was a long, dissonant sound that didn't belong to fire or storm. Dalen knew it from camps where panic arrived in waves and authority rode the second one. He was halfway to standing before the kettle could object, already packing the satchel by muscle memory. Sealant, splints, the stubborn little lantern that behaved like courage when batteries tried not to, and he only paused long enough to ask permission with his eyes. Ashera nodded once, already wrapping a scarf around her ribs with the pragmatism of a veteran, and Mylin slid the waiver into her coat pocket as if paper could be armor. Syria swallowed, squared her shoulders, and held the tent flap with both hands in a posture that would have made a guard dog proud. Outside, the street had developed a crowd the way oil develops a sheen, thin and nervous. The air tasted not of leak, but of intention, and the intention had the clean edges of people who scrub their consciences before doing harm. They came in vests that pretended to be uniforms and masks that pretended not to be fear, calling themselves the civic cleaners in the tone of men who have not met a mirror they trust. "Relocation enforcement," their leader announced, which translated in every head on the block to "we will make a mess and blame hygiene." The younger counselor, crease-deep robe, grievance-thin spine, hovered behind them with a stack of forms he flourished like a weapon he was too nervous to holster. Dalen stepped into the street with the unhurried economy that makes foolishness run late. He kept the satchel visible and his palms clean, every motion announcing, "I am here for injuries only, but make me repeat it, and I will take yours first." The cleaners angled toward the tent with the stomping gait of men who have mistaken concrete for consent, and the leader reached for the flap the way bureaucrats reach for a pen when no one is looking. "Hold," Dalen said, not loud, in the register reserved for stopping hemorrhages and rumors. It should have become theater then, the kind with shouting and a baton's punctuation, if not for the oldest rule on that street suddenly remembering itself. Malin stepped between the leader's hand and the tent like a clerk intercepting a bad invoice. She was small enough to be mistaken for a misprint until she lifted her chin and made eye contact that felt like the click of a sealed hatch. "Are you going to hurt our mom too?" she asked, the sentence crossing the distance like a measured charge. The crowd inhaled in unison. The question made every bystander into a witness and every witness into a conscience. Syria planted her palm flat against the leader's wrist, not pushing, only naming the limb that would be in the report, and added, in a voice that made translators tidy their syntax, "We came to be allowed." The leader was not prepared to be de-escalated by grammar. He snatched his hand back as if burned by plain speech. The cleaners tried to recover with volume. The crowd refused to supply them echo. Ansel wandered out of the shadow with a pipe length of welded truth balanced on his shoulder, and discovered he had business leaning on it, exactly where the tent's guide rope made a line. And Milna materialized with a ledger she had never before used as a shield, holding it like a holy thing and daring anyone to rewrite what she had already stamped. The older sergeant from Checkpoint 19 arrived breathing like a man who had negotiated with stairs. He took in the scene with one glance and did the thing only useful men remember to do. He spoke to the quietest person. "Ashera of House of Dawn," he said to the woman half sitting inside the tent, "do you claim sanctuary under the relief charter you forced us to reread last week?" Ashera, braced against her pain, but not against her fear, answered in the careful diction of someone who intends her words to be excerpted at hearings. "Yes, I claim it. For myself and my children." The younger counselor fumbled through 3 pages looking for a clause that could be made to apologize for her certainty. The cleaners reached the predictable limit of their patience and pulled the kind of net that turns living people into legal bundles. Dalen's hand found the lantern and cracked it to full in one sharp twist. Light leapt onto the net's knotted fibers and made them reflective as gilt. "Optics," he said mildly to the leader, and the word did work faster than any threat. Every window became a camera, every phone a witness, every conscience a lens. The leader swore and swung anyway. Dalen accepted the impact on his left forearm with the bored disdain of a man who has been hit by more persuasive objects, counterweighted with his prosthetic, and stepped inside the leader's reach to make momentum his accomplice. The net sailed short, snagged itself on the guide rope, and the cleaners performed a slapstick unwittingly sincere enough to break the crowd into nervous laughter. It could still have curdled into the right kind of violence if not for 2 things that happened in the same breath. Syria's humming, which had been the low background of all her bravery, shifted upward into a clear, steady tone that she used to judge distances when streets pretended to be oceans. The note hung in the air like a level, and men who run on swagger hate being leveled. And Maylin produced the waiver Milna had stamped that morning, held it above her head with both hands, and read. Slowly, politely, with the kind of enunciation that makes lies embarrassed, the clause that defined their tent as a temporary medical site under charter protection. The older sergeant, perhaps because he had been waiting his whole career to put his boot on the right side of a line, moved without a shout. He planted himself at the tent's rope and said, "Under me," to gravity. The leader of the cleaners saw the math turn against him and tried to negotiate with indignation. Indignation, having recognized better company, left with the crowd. They retreated the way men do who are not used to backing up in public, faces set to a defiant blankness, steps too exact to read as casual. The younger counselor attempted an exit that would leave him on the same side as the stamp on the waiver. He almost pulled it off and might yet learn. The street exhaled in pieces. Laughter first, then the low, scandalized murmur of people surprised to find themselves brave, then the clatter of cups as someone remembered the kettle. Dalen stood in the middle of it with his pulse doing its own math and saw the shake arrive in his hands like a gentleman who will not be refused a dance. Ashera reached out, caught his wrist, and steadied him with the same grip she had used on smaller weapons. "We do not break each other," she said, which was less a compliment than a policy proposal. By the time the captain from 19 showed up with a face that had been briefed by reality, the scene had already filed itself. Waiver affirmed, attempted relocation denied, crowd reminded of their own utility. He took statements the way good men take medicine, without grudge, and asked Ashera if she would prefer a patrol swing by on the hour or on the half. She chose the half, because pain makes time behave differently, and she had decided to be greedy for safety. Milna wrote a memo while standing, stamping it with the same flourish she used on holidays. Ansel pretended his eyes had been sweating. When the last official syllable had been spoken and the street relaxed into the kind of chatter that patches itself into community, Maylin returned the folded waiver to her pocket with a care that turned paper into inheritance. Syria stopped humming and, as if remembered by her own body, yawned. Night recalibrated around the tent. Dalen checked the brace and the dressings with the deliberate slow of a man who refuses to let adrenaline draft his future. The girls counted bandage squares out loud until the number 12 learned to stand without wobbling. Ashura lay back and let the cot have her weight, not surrendering so much as investing, and watched the lantern dim itself to a forgiving halo. "You kept your word," she said into the quiet that had finally learned its job. "So did you." Dalen answered, because staying alive is the oldest kind of promise, and she had not once let his work be the only work in the room. Outside, Rain remembered mercy and practiced. In the morning, Sector 9 tried a rehearsal for a future it had not believed it could cast itself in. Someone set out a folding table with chipped mugs and labeled it triage tea, as if laughter could be protective coloration. The sanitation drone left a bundle of hygiene kits at the tent flap and bleeped a tune it would swear later it had not meant to learn. The Relief Council posted a notice so earnest it blushed. The waiver would remain in effect through the season, the tent recognized as a medical site, and the district encouraged to route assistance to Ward 4, or, failing that, to Dalen Vance's care with receipts. Milna made certain copies and hung one inside the tent at eye level, because rooms forget unless you pin reminders inside them where they can do the most good. The captain from 19 gave the girls 2 whistles on cords, and informed them sternly that whistles were not to be used except for emergencies and music. Syria promised nothing, and tucked hers beneath her shirt like a secret instrument. Ansel delivered a chair that rolled without complaint and declared he'd teach anyone who wanted 2 good welds and a better apology. The work of safety, once permitted, began to do what work does: replicate. Dalen added a second cot and a shelf that could admit the weight of soup without sulking. Ashera coordinated, not as a patient but as a quartermaster of kindness, scheduling blankets and appointments with the same calm that made platoons forgive bad weather. Milan learned to take pulse and record it in block letters that made numbers proud to be understood. Syria discovered that her humming could keep children from panicking, while stitches returned skin to its original arguments. The captain started sending people to the tent who needed quiet more than they needed paperwork. The younger counselor found himself voted temporary chair of a subcommittee on integration of non-standard aid, which is how bureaucracies apologize when taught new math. Mansions of policy do not move for tents, but they sometimes open windows when tents teach them how to breathe. In the evenings, when the tent's lantern painted everybody's faces with a democratic gold, the district practiced being village again. A week later, the Relief Council did something no one expected, and no cynic had rehearsed. They invited Ashera to speak at the corridor where walls have been indifferent for decades, and asked Dalen, formally, with embossed humility, to present the procedural learnings from his unsanctioned success. The room prepared to be embarrassed, and was instead instructed. Ashera stood, brace visible, scarf neat, and told the story in the tense that makes policy listen. "We did this, you saw that. The clause you wrote did a surprising job when we used it correctly. The parts that hurt us have numbers, the parts that saved us have names." Dalen followed with charts that did not lie, and anecdotes that did not flatter, ending not with a plea but with a distribution list. Bleach, blankets, permits, ceasing to treat compassion as contraband. The clerk who had waved them in that first day cried into the sleeve she would later pretend had been wet already. The oldest counselor wrote nothing for a long time, and then wrote one sentence that would become a memo that would become a rule. Keep families together whenever physics allows. Afterward, when the corridor returned to its ordinary talent for pretending it had invented conscience, the 4 of them walked back in a line that made better sense than any procession Sector 9 had seen. The market did not applaud. It adjusted, which is a more expensive compliment. A noodle vendor presented bowls without speeches. The air freshener stall produced a citrus bitter canister with a price that surprised itself and apologized. At the tent, the lantern blinked as if it had been listening to the meeting and approved of its minutes. The kettle, being practical, asked for fire. Dalen took the Guardian of Record card Milna had printed on heavier stock and hung it beside the waiver so gravity could help enforce the promise. Malin, solemn as law, copied the numbers neatly onto the whiteboard and underlined the emergency frequency twice. Syria blew her whistle, very softly, to hear the way safety sounds when it chooses to be a song. Night came honest for once, without ambush. Dalen finished his rounds and ended them where he had started this work, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his back to the cot, the satchel in reach and the lantern tuned to kind. Ashera lay half-turned toward the girls and half-turned toward the door, a habit she would not be asked to break. Malin slept with the waver under her cheek the way children sleep with new books. Syria dreamed with her whistle in her fist and her humming smoothed into breath. "We are allowed," Dalen said into the warm canvas of the tent, and the sentence found its place beside other good ones. "Food with ambition, keep families together, ask then act." Ashera's hand found his wrist in the low light and squeezed once, not gratitude so much as agreement. Outside, the district that had built entire economies on flinching decided for a few hours at least to keep its nerve.